smash. He had bumped the man's head against the floor with all his force, a blow sufficient to stun a giant, and in an instant had tossed him against the wall. There the alchemist lay. Like a panther moving to attack, Peter seized the object which he had come to procure and leaped for the door. He did not reach it unscathed. Pan Kreutz had also a last stratagem. It was fortunate for him that when the Cossack bumped his head against the floor, it was his mask that had borne the brunt of the blow. Otherwise, it is doubtful if he could ever have risen. But when the Cossack tossed him aside, he lay there feigning unconsciousness, and as the other turned, he reached with a swiftness as quick as Peter's into a pocket of his gown, where he had concealed a small package of explosive powder which might be ignited only by concussion. A wonder it was indeed that the powder had not exploded while they were wrestling on the floor. This Pan Kreutz poised in his right hand as Peter made for the door. In another second the man would be gone. The alchemist caught his balance and hurled the package with all his strength. It was a fair shot. It caught the Cossack with full force square on the back of the head and burst with a loud report. Those below, now already turning their attention to the noise and the confusion on the second floor, heard the sharp explosion and saw the court flooded with light. In the midst of the glare there came a shriek that seemed to stir every corner of the courtyard, and almost immediately a man with hair flaming and garments streaked with fire sprang from the threshold of Pan Andrew's lodging to the edge of the stairway that had not collapsed, and darted to the floor above. He stopped there only for one fleeting glance below. The court, blazing with torches and alive with tumult, was full of figures, students, watchmen, soldiers, so that escape that way was impossible. He leaped to the loft stairway and mounted it. Clutching at the roof, which was not far above his head, he swung the low door back until it lay alongside the house and then climbed over it to the roofing. Along this he rushed like a meteor, his blazing hair streaming behind him in a trail of sparks. He leaped to an adjoining roof, and then to another, until he came to a place where the roof sloped down to a wall, and there he was seen last. A hue and cry was set up, but the man had escaped. Some said that he ran along the top of the wall and leaped into a monastery garden beyond, others that he only pretended to descend and had crept back among the housetops. At any rate, he was not discovered. When temporary stairs were finally put in place, the watchmen released Joseph and his mother from the small room in their own quarters where they had lain bound, and brought Elzbietka down to them. Pan Kreutz, who had retired to his loft where he shed his torn gown and his mask, was bleeding and weak from his struggle and lost no time in getting into his bed. It was thought by all that the robbers had carried away nothing. But when Pan Andrew returned in the morning, the house was searched thoroughly, only to find that the treasure was missing. Spectators swore that Peter could not have carried anything with him when he made his perilous escape over the roofs, and a few said that they had noticed that his hands were empty. However, hunt high or low as they did, the treasure was gone, and Pan Andrew, in spite of the views of the spectators, was fully convinced that the robber had stolen it. Those of Peter's band who had been injured in the fall of the stairs or had been unable to escape from the court were taken to jail and sentenced to various punishments. Several were put away into dungeons where they could do no more harm. 2 were banished for a period of 99 years, and the rest were delivered to justice in other towns where they had committed previous crimes. But the most vigorous questioning could get no information from them, and it was concluded that they knew little of the designs of the leader upon Pan Andrew. As for Stas, his mother would have naught of him after this act of treachery. She lost little time in turning him out of her house, and never would she receive him back again. It was heard some time later that he had become a waiter in the Inn of the Golden Elephant, but after the robbery of a guest there one night he disappeared and was never heard of in Krakow again. Pan Kreutz, although somewhat unnerved by his share in the encounter, met Pan Andrew in his lodging the next morning and described as fully as he could the man who had been leader in the events of the preceding night. He had scarcely finished when Pan Andrew sprang to his feet and struck the back of his chair with his fist. "It is as I thought," he exclaimed fiercely, "the man who has assailed me twice before. And now I know for a certainty that it is that half-Mongol, half-Cossack that calls himself Bogdan and is known as the Terrible throughout the Cossack lands. I have heard of his evil deeds many times, as has every dweller in the Ukraine, and it would be like him indeed to lead this villainy against me. He is a very devil, a man without pity, though I will say a man of the boldest breed that God ever benefited with the gift of breath. We, the Poles of the Ukraine, knew him as Peter of the Button-Face because of the scar which you have seen upon his right cheek, and by that scar I would doubtless have recognized him on the morning when he attacked me outside the Krakow gate, had I not believed that he carried on his lawless deeds always nearer the border. Thus saying, he went sorrowfully to his work of repairing the damage done by the Cossack band. Chapter 11. The Attack on the Church. Down in the Ukraine that winter, when men went about from habitation to habitation on the little horses that had noses so pointed that they could poke them through the snow and eat the dry grass of the steppe beneath, it was known that a great change had come over a certain Bogdan, called the Terrible, along the Dnieper and Volga, and Peter of the Button-Face among the Polish colonists. It was not that he had lost so much hair that certain ones called him behind his back Bogdan of the singed locks, that made him sad and contemplative instead of boisterous and ready as he had once been. It was the effect of some failure that brought on despondency and kept him a recluse for several months. When he did return at length to men's sight, and began to appear in the taverns, his hair had grown to its accustomed length, and a huge scar that fire had made was nearly healed over. It was hinted, too, that he had made a journey clear up to the land of the Muscovites, and had had conference with Ivan, called the Great, but this he did not speak about, and men dared not question him. Spring came with the month of March in the year 1462, with peace over all the Dnieper lands, save where here and there tribes were on the march, or the Tartars were threatening raids. With spring set out Bogdan the Terrible, and with him traveled as fine a crowd of cutthroats and cattle-stealers as ever the Ukraine knew. They rode to Rovno, the town of the level plain, and then struck out for Chelm on the border just beyond the river Bug. They established headquarters in the Lublin woods for a time, for the purpose of pillaging, and then hearing that soldiers had been sent after them, they vanished into the swamplands to the north and were not heard of again in those parts. It seems that Peter had opposed this pillaging from the first, because he had other work in hand. But they were tribesmen, and wild, fond of robbery and theft, and eager for gain. At Tarnov, having them well in hand again, he organized them into a caravan of Armenian rug merchants, and marched them, carts, horses, and merchants, to Krakow, the great market of the eastern part of Europe. In Krakow they camped with their wares in the square on the east side of the Cloth Hall. Now, the saddest man in Krakow at this time was Pan Andrew Charnetsky. Sad because he had lost, through no fault of his own, a treasure which he had intended to present to the King of Poland, and evidently a treasure of great worth, since certain men seemed to envy him its possession. Jan Kanti sought to comfort him, and his wife and son and Elzbietka did much to divert his thoughts from the seriousness of the loss. But on the long nights when he was alone in the tower, moods of depression would often engulf him. Joseph, knowing this, took to visiting him in the night vigils when it was possible, before holy days and vacations when there was no collegium on the following morning. Often he would come with his father at the 10th hour of the night and remain until morning. Sometimes he would take the duties of the watchman while his father slept, and sound the hynals at each hour and inspect the city regularly from each of the tower windows, in order to sound the alarm whenever a red tongue of flame leaped into the sky. Joseph had progressed each day in playing the trumpet, and could now sound the hynal as well as his father. He was in the tower with Pan Andrew on this same night that Peter and his caravan of merchants were encamped in their carts in the marketplace below the church. The moon was at its full, and the shadows of the church towers fell far across the street and market. Down in front of the church doors, a watchman with lantern and halberd paced to and fro, calling out, as was his custom, the hours as they were sounded from the tower. He had already called out the first hour when Peter of the Button-Face, watching from a cart across the square, decided to make his first move. "Michael!" he called in a loud whisper. "Michael!" And at that a man in a suit of leather with hat to match and thick sandals slid out of the next cart. He had already divested himself of the round turban and blankets that he wore as an Armenian merchant, and his body seemed to move in a constant succession of quiverings and glidings. In fact, he had always been known in the Ukraine as the Snake, and he stood for a moment by his chief's wagon to receive a whispered command in one ear. Then, true to his name, he wriggled beneath a dozen carts and passed the flank of an outhouse near the church to take refuge behind a tree that grew at this corner of the Rheineck. Doubled up here, he waited until the watchman should pass in front of the church. He had not long to wait. Out from the shadows at the base of the church emerged suddenly a man carrying a lantern that threw a star-shaped light about it. This man tested the door to the stairs leading to the Trumpeter's Tower, found it securely locked, yawned, and struck the paving stones several times in front of the door with his long halberd, as if he were weary of doing nothing. The Snake's eyes sized up this man as his opponent. He was a man, perhaps past middle age, clad in a garment of leather over which was a very light chain armor, poorly woven. This fell like a skirt with pointed edges just below the knees. Above the waist, the links of armor were a bit heavier, extending over the shoulders and back into long sleeves clear to the wrist, and up past the neck to a kind of head covering like a cowl, over which he wore a pointed helmet of rough metal. Outside the armor he wore a very short leather vest caught with a belt from which hung a short sword, and across the shoulders just below the neck another belt with a buckle at the left where the halberd could be secured and balanced. He passed from the front of the church to the south side, looked about carefully to see if there were any signs of life in the street or square, and, finding none, turned away from the church and entered the churchyard at the south where the moonlight fell brightly upon the old gravestones. Squatting down behind one of these and crossing himself as if in excuse to the people buried there for disturbing their slumbers, he laid his halberd on the ground at his right side and the lantern at the left. Then, reaching into a wallet which he wore at his girdle, he took out a crust of bread and a huge portion of meat. These he began to eat with no suspicion of any interruption. In this conduct he was justified, for he had been doing this same thing over and over again for many years. There had been no serious duties about the church, save perhaps on a holy day when youth on mischief bound would play some trick upon the watchman, and them he could easily dispatch about their business. Thieves seldom troubled churches in this period, and the cemetery itself was guard enough against marauders in a period full of superstition. Up above him the trumpeter kept a much stricter vigil, and all about the town the watch tried house doors and questioned late passers-by. "Oh, ho, hum," he yawned. Such a quiet thing was life. But flattened against the church wall behind him was one whose intention might have disturbed those weary thoughts had the watchman been able to discern it. The Snake had sized up this situation with rapidity and had taken advantage of the moment that the watchman turned his back upon the square to dart into the projecting shadow of a buttress. Edging along the wall, he moved cautiously until he was but a few yards from the tombstone by which the watchman sat. Pluff! The Snake had pounced like a hawk on a mouse. There was not even a scuffle, so prepared was the intruder, and so taken by surprise was the victim. Down went the watchman on his back by the side of the grave, and in a second the deft Michael had bound his scarf tightly about the man's mouth so that he could not utter a sound. It was the work of a moment as well, to secure the hands and feet with short bits of rope that he carried in his jacket. He was at first minded to cut the man's throat with his own sword, but he feared lest he might make one last dying cry and upset all their plans. Inside the victim's leather vest he found a huge brass key. This he cut loose from the short chain which held it and thrust it into his own belt. Then, making sure that the bonds were secure, he leaped back into the shadow of the church and stole back to the wagon of his chief as deftly as he had come. "I have bound and gagged the watchman behind yon gravestone," he reported, "and here is the key to the tower door." A whispered command traveled along the line of carts. Then there was a general doffing of blankets and turbans, and the band of Peter, in leather jackets and hats, high hose and tall soft boots, stood ready behind their carts to follow the leader into his excellently planned enterprise. It was but a short distance from the carts to the tower, and Peter led the way, keeping close to the ground in the shadow cast by the tower. They stood at length, about 20 of them, within the shelter of the angle which the tower made with the church. "Keep close behind me," said the leader, "when we mount the steps, and watch lest there be loose boards in the stairs beneath your feet. The boy is here this night in the tower with his father. Mount carefully, but rush and secure both father and son when I give you word." Here he fitted the key which Michael had stolen from the watchman to the lock and swung the small iron door on its hinges. He had to stoop as he went in. "Quiet," he whispered. "Follow closely." In a very few minutes they were all inside. The last man, following directions, closed the iron door so that if a curious passer-by should inspect it, he would find it shut as it was usually. "The task is easy," whispered Peter when they had climbed the narrow steps that led to the stairs built in the tower scaffolding. "We have now but to bag our rabbit. But you must see to it that he is not a noisy rabbit. If he once gets his hand on a bell rope, he will awaken the whole town with his ringing. He must be secured quickly." They went up and up, mounting quietly the stairs that wound about the heavy scaffolding, and treading ever carefully so that not a single board should squeak. At last the leader stopped. "The light is just ahead," he whispered. Through the open door of the tower room came suddenly the voice of Joseph. "You can sleep for the rest of the night, father," he said. "I will sound the hay knoll at every hour. The hourglass is plain to read, and I shall make no error." It was lucky to hit upon a night when they were together, thought Peter. "We can bind the old one and make the young one show us the way to the prize." Joseph had just spread a manuscript before him on the table in the tower room, and had moved a taper close to it to begin reading, when he heard a sudden noise just outside the door. Turning about sharply, he was just in time to see the door thrown violently open, and then 3 men rushed toward him before he could even assume a defensive attitude. He was absolutely powerless. One man held his arms as closely gripped as in a vice, while the 2 others leaped upon Pan Andrew as he rose, dazed with astonishment, from the little bed. A 4th man stood in the doorway. His hands were at his hips, and he laughed merrily. "Ho, ho, my merry singing birds," he said. "We meet again high up above the noisy world where none can come to disturb us." Then his brows darkened, and he asked, "Do you know why I am here?" Joseph shuddered. This man was the same that had met his father on the crowd in the Rheineck to stone his people. This was the voice that he had heard while he lay bound hand and foot in the small room of his lodgings. But at the same time he wondered what had brought the man back to the city. He had already obtained the prize, Joseph thought, after the risk and danger of the first trial. Was it, perhaps, that he wished to avenge himself upon his father for the incident of the cart? Joseph made a motion as if to cross himself at thought of this, for here they were high up in the air above the city, and nothing would be easier than to hurl a man from the summit into the graveyard below, and none would know of it until morning came and they found the lifeless victim. Pan Andrew, however, looked at the intruder steadily. "No," he said very deliberately, "I do not know why you are here. But I do know you now, Peter of the button face, sometimes called Bald Dan. It is strange that I did not recognize you that morning when you threatened me." Peter took notice in no way of Pan Andrew's latter statement. He heard only the negative answer. Apparently he had not expected it.
"You do not. You lie."
"Do you think that I do not know everything?" He pushed his way in and held the candle close to the prisoner's face. "I say to you that I have come all this way to get what I want. I have the means for doing it, too, and I have men in this company that would rather see a daub like you dead than alive. Now come, if you value your skin. Where have you hidden the great Tarnov Crystal?" Joseph leaped with a thrill. This, then, was the prize that they had brought from the Ukraine, a crystal, the great Tarnov Crystal, whose loss the father had not ceased to mourn. But, after all, was a crystal something that men valued so highly? If it were a diamond or a precious stone, there might be some reason for so much covetousness. But a mere crystal, why, he himself knew caves in the Ukraine where one might knock rock crystals from the walls. But perhaps this had a certain significance. "You know as well as I," returned Pan Andrew, "that it disappeared on that same night that you attacked my lodgings. If you have it not, I know not where it is to be found." It disappeared. Peter was at first shocked, then incredulous. "You lie," he shrieked. "You lie. You have it still. I will find a way." "Come here," he called to Michael the snake. "Take this boy to the house where he lives and keep always your knife at his throat. I will stay with the old one here, and if you do not return in a quarter of an hour, we will put this Pole out of all trouble in this world." "No," he continued, as if changing his mind. "I will go with the brat myself. While we look the house over, you keep your sword close to the old fox's throat. If the boy leads me the wrong way, I'll slit his throat. Likewise, if he tries to betray me. But if we do not return with the crystal in a reasonable time, do as I have told you." That Pan Andrew would gladly give up the crystal to save not only his own life, but that of the boy, the Cossack had believed firmly. Therefore, his denial of the possession of the crystal was unlooked for and baffling. However, he dismissed the matter from his mind promptly. Undoubtedly, Pan Andrew had lied to him, and unless something unforeseen happened, it would be but a matter of a few minutes' time before the crystal was in his own hands. It was true that Joseph might not know the exact hiding place of the crystal. What he did know was that the men in the tower would kill his father if he did not return at once with the prize, and he and the mother would make a quick search of the house in order to find it and redeem the father. It did occur to Peter that perhaps Pan Andrew had deposited it elsewhere, but if the house did not give up its prize, then they would return and try to torture the information out of the father. "Stay," he said suddenly, just as Joseph's captor delivered the boy into his hands. "The hourglass there on the table shows that the sand has fallen to the second hour. It is time that the trumpet was sounded from this place, otherwise someone may suspect that something is wrong and come up here to see. You, boy, you trumpet sometimes, I know. Surprises you, does it? Peter has eyes and ears everywhere. So, before we set out to get this precious stone, take down that trumpet from the wall. Oh, no, leave it there a moment and come here." He led him to the bell rope outside and stood over him. "Ring twice upon the bell, then get your trumpet and play your Haynal from the 4 windows." He watched the boy carefully, with his knife gleaming in his hands, as Joseph tugged twice at the cord that moved the hammer against the bell. "Do as you always do, and play no tricks." As Joseph went back to the little room and took up the trumpet, he was thinking of another young trumpeter who, standing in the old tower over this same spot, had fallen pierced by an arrow while performing his duty. And it seemed curious that he, too, was called upon to show his mettle in much the same way. In his heart, much of the first tumult of fear had died out. There had come to him that gift of everlasting stanchness which had been one of the most characteristic qualities of the Polish people. It was perhaps the inspiration which the thought of that other trumpeter had brought, for immediately afterward, and at the minute that he had thrust the trumpet through the tower opening on the west, his mind flew back to his conversation one day with Elzbietka. He had spoken in jest that day about the Heinal, but she had taken it as a childish secret. Bless her! He was sure that she would remember. This hope increased instantly. He knew that Elzbietka was awake to take his father's place, and if the Heinal was played straight through and 2 or 3 notes were added at the end where usually the music broke off on the broken note, she would know that something was wrong. What would she do? Her uncle, lost in his experiments, would only laugh at her fancy, as he would call it. Would she dare in the night to go to Jean Canty? If she did, it was possible that Canty could summon the watch quickly enough to save his father's life, for he felt in his heart that Peter meant to kill Pan Andrew after the crystal was found. It all depended on this. Did Peter know the story of the Tartar invasion and the broken note at the end of the Heinal? God must be trusted that he did not. This prayer was on Joseph's lips as Peter said, "Now for your music." Up went the trumpet. Then it seemed to Joseph that he had once done this very thing before. The whole world changed beneath him. The great stone city had become wood, and it was everywhere in flames. Men of short stature and ugly faces were riding about furiously on little horses. Close at hand, the man had descended from his horse and had drawn a bow from his shoulders and an iron-tipped arrow from a quiver. The bow bent, the arrow was notched. He played. Peter nodded. The Heinal was not new to him, and he knew that the boy was playing as usual. That is, he knew up to a certain point. Joseph hesitated at the place where the music ordinarily breaks off. This time he added 3 notes of his own, which definitely finished the Heinal. It took courage to play those notes, for he knew not but that at any moment he might feel the Cossack's dagger in his throat. At length he let the trumpet fall and looked about. The blood surged into his head with a rush. The Cossack was nodding approval. He did not know then. He went to the windows at south, east, and north successively, and played as he had already played. "Now hurry for your lodgings." Peter gripped the boy's arm and pushed him ahead all the way down the stairs, after giving final orders to the men who guarded Pan Andrew. They found no one in the square below and slunk along in the shadows toward the university district. The Cossack was exulting again that his plans were working, and as he went along he looked about him for a quiet corner where he could finish Joseph with his dagger once he had the crystal in his hands and was on the way back to the tower. Then they would settle with the father, and there would be no one left to give information concerning them. A company of Armenian merchants would leave the city unhindered in the course of the following day. Chapter 12. E.L.Z. by Eka misses the broken note. Very much earlier on this same eventful night, a girlish figure emerged from the door leading to Alchemist Kreutz's lodgings on the 3rd floor of the building where Pan Andrew lived, and stole quietly down the steps to the 2nd floor. Here she rapped 3 times. In a space of perhaps a minute, the door was thrown back a little, and Joseph's mother peered cautiously out through the crack. "Come in, child," she said heartily as she recognized Elzbietka's face. "What brings you out so late?" she inquired a moment later as she shot the heavy bolts back into place and secured the door. "Has this student Tring been troubling you or your uncle lately, or what is it? Sit there at the table where I was just finishing my sewing for the day and tell me the whole story."
"Yes," answered the girl. "It is the student Tring."
"He and uncle are in the loft now, and I am somewhat frightened. They have been talking more queerly than ever all this evening." "You must stay with me here this night," the woman said. "It's a shame that such a scholar as your uncle should have anything to do with that student Tring. I fear that young man very much. He seems to me like one who has grown old and then become young again. When he looks at me with those great dark eyes, it seems as if he were thinking of terrible things. "Ah, I will stay here, and gladly, mother," she answered, for in these months of sweet acquaintanceship the affection of the woman and girl had become much like that which exists between mother and daughter. But it is not that I fear anything, myself, from the student Tring. It is really my uncle's conduct these few weeks that troubles me, and more especially his conduct since that night when the men came here to steal. He is so changed. I have seen, Joseph's mother replied. But has he ever been cruel to you? Oh, no, never that. But he is not at all as he was when we first came here to live. Then he was full of merriment, ready to talk or laugh with me, eager to go somewhere or to see something that would be of pleasure to us both. Now he does not seem to think of me at all. He is always like one in a dream. Sometimes when I speak to him, he does not seem to hear. Other times he answers my questions queerly, saying things that I had not thought of. He is caught up in something that I fear, and something that has little good in it. It's the student Tring who has done all this. Yes, I think that he has done much of it. They two are together every night, and they work together in the loft above my head. I can hear them moving about occasionally, though sometimes a terrible silence is all that there is. My dear child, the woman laid her work by for the moment, this is always your home here. Come here when there is anything to trouble you. The little bed is always yours. We, too, are greatly troubled as well, as perhaps you know. Pan Andrew has not been the same since that accursed night. Yet if one had but sense, we have here all that should make man happy. Children, love, bread, and a house. Why must men be always sighing and striving for that which they have not? We were so happy before, continued Elzbietka. It seems to me that the student Tring has some charm over my uncle which he cannot resist. Heaven help us, exclaimed the woman, making the sign of the cross. And have you any idea what is going on in the loft above you? None. The girl shuddered. It is some terrible thing. Tonight both men spoke in such a peculiar way that I was frightened when they first came together. And ever since that they have been speaking more wildly, I think, than ever before. My uncle keeps saying, "This will drive me mad," and Tring says to him again, "There is nothing of harm in it." Try once more. Then again there is silence, and my uncle speaks shortly, mad things, and I was frightened and came here. My poor child. Just before I came downstairs, Tring was speaking to my uncle as if he were just a common servant. And my uncle, instead of being angry, seemed to be trying to please the student. At last Tring said, "This now you must do. You must learn the secret which will change brass into gold. Once you have gold, then you have the power to do all that man can do. You can go about over the earth and see all that there is to see. You can study with the most famous masters and buy all that you please." He repeated over and over again the word gold, and it seemed to me that while he was speaking my uncle was working at something, for he never answered a word. The woman shook her head. "I have known of those who sought to make gold out of baser metal, but no good ever befell them." Then, thinking that she needed to draw the girl's thoughts away from herself and her troubles, she said, "I am often lonely these nights, when Joseph and his father are away. Yet I often listen for the sound of the trumpet in the church tower, and I know that everything is well with them. And I. Joseph begins at the second hour. We have a secret, he and I always listen for him to play. Bless your heart. Do you mean to say that you lie awake until the... I do when he is playing. For he is my best friend, and one should be loyal unto friends. Can you tell when he is playing and when the father? I could easily at first. Now it is much harder, but I think that I could distinguish, did I not know at what hours each played. His notes are not quite so pointed as the father's, but they are becoming more and more like them all the time. The conversation ran to other matters, and it grew late. Finally, the woman made up a bed for the girl on a small couch which Joseph and his father had built. It was close to the outer door and directly below the casement, over which a piece of tapestry hung. The window was open in this fair weather, and Elzbieta could easily hear noises from outside, especially the sound of the church bells and the trumpet, for the window faced in the direction of the tower. Joseph's mother retired to the Elzbieta without undressing, for she feared lest the alchemist should call her suddenly, threw herself on the couch and tried to sleep. She found sleep impossible. Visions of some terrible thing happening to her uncle and the student kept her thoughts boiling like water in a kettle. She kept remembering the words that other people had said, the remarks made by other students, the whispers up and down the lane that Pan Kreutz was engaged in some terrible work of black magic. It was a superstitious age, an age when people believed that powers of evil could be called upon, like human beings, to perform certain dark deeds, that souls of the dead forever haunted certain lonely places on earth and would answer a question if one but knew how to address them. If a black cat crossed one's path, then bad luck was sure to follow. If an owl hooted at exactly midnight from the tower of some deserted church, then the witches were riding through the air on brooms or branches. If a dog howled in the night, it was a sign that someone living nearby was about to die. There were people who fostered such ideas for their own benefit. They were, for the most part, necromancers or magicians who took the gold of credulous ones for telling them of their own futures or for warding off some impending evil from them. Perhaps some few of these believed themselves honest. The greater number were thoroughly dishonest and unscrupulous. Men who wore dark robes and practiced dark ways simply to frighten superstitious folk into giving them money. These magicians sold articles called tokens, which were guaranteed to keep away certain evils. A little ball of black stone would prevent the possessor from being bitten by snakes. The little yellow glass-like substance, created when lightning struck in sand and melted the fine particles, was greatly valued. Crumbled and taken internally, it would prevent stomach trouble. Worn about the neck in a small bag, it would keep off lightning. Certain little bones from the bodies of cats, dogs, and hares had properties of benefit. The heart of a frog had many mystic qualities. It was quite apparent in the case of the alchemist Kreutz that something was going on that was undermining his health and perhaps his reason. Such a change as had come over him was not at all normal in a man with such a strong body and mind as he possessed. And as Elzbieta lay awake thinking of one thing after another, she became a prey to many strange fears, among them this one, that Kreutz was no longer the master of his own soul, that somehow the student Tring had become the master of it, that Tring had discovered something in his studies which he was working out at the expense of the man who naturally should have been his teacher and master. The trumpet had, in the meanwhile, sounded the first hour, but still she was not able to sleep. Her natural thoughts of her uncle and Tring were followed by a flood of fanciful imaginings, and in them she saw the figures warped and distorted out of their natural proportions. Persons who are sick and persons who carry troubles in their minds experience this frequently, at a time when the body is tired and aching for sleep, and yet when the mind is overactive with worries. Her uncle, at 1 minute of normal and ordinary size, seemed at intervals to shrink or enlarge without warning. Tring was now a student of the collegiate type, now a nightmare of a thing with the head of a pumpkin that grew until the whole sky was filled with the darkness of his shadow. They were engaged in many nefarious enterprises. They were releasing great hordes of bats from baskets, bats that they had created out of old sandals. They were leaping into the air and catching huge birds like eagles which they were imprisoning under the roof of the loft. They were mixing fiery liquids that hissed and bubbled and foamed. They were doing 1,000 things at once, and all of them somehow of evil. For nearly an hour these phantoms of half-sleep danced in her brain, and then suddenly the bell on the tower sounded twice. "The second hour!" she exclaimed, the drowsy phantoms of her brain taking sudden flight. The Heinal began. "That is Joseph," she thought. She was humming the tune, already following him note by note. She reached the place where the hymn ended, and ceased there to wait until he began to play again from the second of the 4 windows. But the next upon the broken note that came at the end of the Heinal, but had added a note or two, and brought the little hymn to an end in the way that pieces of music usually end. Elzbieta sat upright on the bed, although she was quite certain that some trick had been played upon her by her senses. "Perhaps I was but half awake," she thought. "I will listen more closely when he plays it the second time." He began to play from the south side. This time she did not hum the tune over, but followed each note intently. When he had finished, she realized that for the second time he had not stopped upon the broken note, but had gone ahead with the additional notes, which made the Heinal sound like a finished piece of music and not one that was broken off. "He is playing it wrongly," she repeated to herself. He played next on the east side, but the wind carried the sound away this time. When he came to the last window, the window on the north, the sound came clearly to Elzbieta's ears. "This time I shall know," she said. At first she thought that he was going to stop upon the broken note, for he hesitated there, but then he went on ahead as if to say, "I know that I should stop here, but am not stopping," and added the extra notes which finished the strain, just as the young trumpeter would probably have finished it had he not been shot down by the Tartar bowman. Elzbieta was off the bed and on her feet. He had played it in such fashion deliberately. Joseph was far too good a trumpeter to make the same mistake at least 3 times. But what could it mean? That Joseph was in some trouble. But there was the great alarm bell, which once sounded would rouse the town in an incredibly short time. This bell was always employed in times of fire, invasion, defense, and such various events as riots, the visit of a foreign king, the declaration of war. He certainly would not trifle with such a sacred thing as the Heinal for a mere pastime. Therefore, why did he not ring the bell? There could be but one answer. The girl had half realized it with the very first false note of the first playing of the Heinal. This was a signal to her, Elzbieta Kreutz. Joseph was in some strange, some unusual kind of distress. He counted upon her to remember the little secret that he had made in joking. He counted upon her to understand that he was in trouble. Why, perhaps he was even held by force. Here her intuition actually leaped to the truth. Perhaps some person was watching him so that he could not ring the bell. Yes, it was for her ears that he was playing. And she must act. She must help Joseph at once. Only, what was the wisest course? She could not bring herself to alarm the boy's mother. Should she call her uncle? He was still with Johann Tring in the loft. The light was there, and there had been no sound of the student descending. Both, she knew, would laugh at her fears and send her back to bed. Therefore she moved quietly from the couch across the floor to the door, where she threw back the bolts and drew the door open. Stepping across the threshold, she closed the door and ascended to her own lodging, where she procured the key to the outer door and threw a cloak about her head and shoulders. In a very short time she was in the street. At such an hour as this in the morning it was dangerous for an unarmed man, and even more for an unarmed woman, to pass through the streets. Late roisterers were abroad. Gamblers, drunkards, thieves, the very filth and scum of the city were crouching in corners or picking the pockets of some man who had been struck down from behind. The city watch were preventive enough against crime if they responded in numbers large enough to cope with thieves and murderers who often worked in bands, but the law satisfied itself with treating most cruelly the few prisoners that fell into its clutches and let the great majority of offenders go unmolested. Therefore a man's best friend in dark city streets, particularly at such a late hour as this, was his good sword or cudgel. Once outside the building wall, Elzbieta breathed a prayer to her patron saint, the good Elizabeth, and observing in the bright light of the moon that the street of the pigeons was for the moment empty, kept her back close to the wall and edged her way slowly in the wall's shadow to the cross street at the left, through which she had planned to dart for St. Anne's Street, only a block distant. She was at the very corner and had climbed out from the sheltering buttress of the wall when there came the sound of men's voices from the Street of the Pigeons directly behind her. Without turning about to see who was there, she darted around the corner into the cross street and broke into a run over its rough cobbles. Someone, however, had seen her. She heard a voice cry, "Who is there?" And there was the sound of feet pursuing her. "A woman, as I live," she heard a pursuer say as she dashed ahead. The moon seemed to hang over the very head of the cross street, so that none of the buildings threw a shadow. The pursuers had already turned the corner from the Street of the Pigeons and came flying ahead in great leaps and bounds. She thought of Tartars and Peter of the Button-Face, but it was no such folk as that who followed her. This small company of men was but a band of rags and tatters, beggars and petty thieves and filthy cozeners, seeking only to fleece some passer-by of a few gross in order to get drinks or a hard corner in which to sleep. A girl of her age was just such prey as these wretched people sought, for they could plunder her without fear of harm, and her clothing, or perhaps some bundle that she carried, would bring a few coins for their need. "Stop, stop, we are friends," the first of them called out. "We would not harm a woman in the street at such an hour." "Listen, we will go with you where you are going." But the tone of the voice only made Elzbietka run the harder. Into St. Anne's Street she turned at length, with the men close behind. Her one hope now was that Giancanti would answer his bell quickly, for if she did not slip inside almost immediately, the men following would catch up to her. However, summons for help from Giancanti seldom waited long without an answer. He had been busy all that night with his writings, at which he worked incessantly when he was not aiding some world-wrecked soul, writings which were to prove of inestimable value to the university and the whole world of culture after his death. Therefore the ringing of the bell took him but a few steps from his work. As he unlocked the door and flung it open, the girl darted by him and into the house. "It is I, Elzbietka Kreutz," she said. "Good father, I come with news that needs action, I think, and that immediately. But first close the door, since there are some pursuing me." The scholar closed the door. If he felt astonishment at the sight of a young girl flying through the streets at such an hour, he did not show it. He was, as a matter of fact, used to all kinds of strange happenings. Even when the wretched beggars raced past the door wondering what had become of their victim, he had an impulse to go out and talk to them and eventually share his purse with them, since he knew that it was only poverty and starvation that drove them to such extremes. But recognizing the girl's distress and her immediate need for him, he closed the door and led the way into his study. "What has happened, daughter? Has there been a robbery again in the house, or has thine uncle gotten himself into some difficulty?" "Something of the sort there is, I feel and know." She recited her story as best she could, for she was short-breathed from running and from her anxiety for Joseph. If only he would not smile! If only he would not think that she had been dreaming! But the venerable scholar was far from smiling. "You are right," he exclaimed spiritedly, almost before she had finished her tale. "There is no time to wait. He is in some grave danger, which may the good God divert from him. Remain here where you will be safe. I will at once send a servant of the university to call the watch, and will go with them myself to the tower. I fear something of evil has happened." A few minutes later, 30 men of the city watch, in heavy armor, were marching upon the church. They found first the church watchman securely bound in the churchyard and released him. Then they entered the tower through the unlocked door and began silently and cautiously to climb the stairs. In the meantime, the band of Cossacks high up in the tower above had begun to grow weary of this excursion. At first, the idea of an attack in mid-air, and in a church tower at that, had piqued their curiosity and aroused their thirst for adventure, since such an attack had heretofore been entirely outside their experience. And when earlier in the evening Peter had called for the 10 volunteers he needed, not one man among them could be induced to remain behind. But the affair had proved to be of a simplicity that had no appeal for men so bloodthirsty. In truth, so well had Peter's plans been laid, and so secure from intrusion did they feel in this lofty stronghold, and so irksome was the waiting for their leader, that they had succumbed one by one to the drowsiness of the early morning hour, and with the exception of the one man who stood guard over the trumpeter, they were sprawled out idly or were dozing. Therefore men of the city watch, when they had crept noiselessly to the top, surprised them completely. In truth, they were captives before they were quite on their guard or realized what was happening. Pan Andrew's god himself did not have time to carry out the leader's command. He was, in fact, made prisoner, as he was upon the point of delivering a death blow. While they were binding the last prisoner's arms, Joseph came running and leaping up the steps and threw himself into his father's embrace. "Father, father," he shouted excitedly, "it was Elzbietka who did this." His eyes were shining as he thought about it. "Elzbietka, Elzbietka," he kept repeating. She heard me sound the trumpet in a different fashion from the way I usually sound it, for tonight I did not stop the high noll upon the broken note, but played several notes more. She ran through the night alone to Jean Canty's, and he aroused the city watch. I just met him at the foot of the stairs, and he told me the whole story. "Bless the girl," said the father, tears rising to his eyes. "And you, my son, how did you get free?" I feared. The man who was dragging me toward our home heard the watch marching through the street, and when he realized that they were going toward the church, he took himself off like lightning into the darkness without another thought for me. But Elzbietka is at the scholar's dwelling in the university building, waiting. I must go to her quickly and tell her all, and thank her that we are alive this night. Pan Andrew was busy with his own thoughts when the watch finally marched away with their prisoners. The great Tarnov Crystal, the great Tarnov Crystal. That was what the Tartar said he had come for. Was it possible that the man had been telling the truth? For what other reason could he have surprised him thus in the tower? For what other reason the hurried expedition into the town with the boy, Joseph, and the instructions he had left with his men? If it had been revenge alone that the man was seeking, then he and Joseph would never have remained alive until now. But if the man had not obtained the crystal on the night of his attack upon his lodgings, then what in the name of heaven and earth had happened to it on that night, and where was the crystal now? Chapter 13. The Great Tarnov Crystal. It was late one evening in April, a few weeks after the unsuccessful attack of Peter upon the tower, that the alchemist Kreutz and the student Johann Tring were sitting upon rude stools in the loft above the alchemist's lodging, arguing with much heat some question that had arisen between them. The day had been sultry for early spring, and the sun was setting red over the distant hills, flooding with its crimson the high mound called the Krakow Mound over beyond the river on the road to Welichka and the salt mines. Tring sat where he could see the sunshine through the little window, but the alchemist sat within the gathering darkness of the room. Above their heads on the slanting walls, vials and glass tubes of the alchemist's craft gleamed like precious stones, and every now and then some substance lying upon the hot coals of the braziers would hiss up into a little flame and smoke, for all the world like a serpent suddenly raising its slender head and coils above a quiet patch of grass. "I tell you that I have had enough," the alchemist replied to some remark of the students. "I am ready to forswear this scientific experiment into which we have so boldly launched, and go back to my old studies, which are much better suited to a God-fearing man." Tring laughed, low but maliciously. "So that is where your courage lies," he answered. "That is the crown of valor that you boast in exploring the wonders of the unknown world. Come," he added after a minute, as if changing his tactics in dealing with this man who was now thoroughly in his power, or so he thought. Come and put a better complexion upon things. We are already past the hardest stretch of the road. If there is to be found the solution to that problem upon which we both have spent so much time, it will be found so much the more readily now because of the sacrifices that we have already made for it. Are the trances tiring you beyond endurance? The alchemist let his head sink into his hands. I am tired, was all that he could say. Tring regarded him with disgust, but held back the angry words which sprang to his lips and expressed himself more gently. Then if there is a fault, it must lie with you, Pankreuz, he said. It is beyond my understanding that such a man as you should find exhaustion in these simple experiments that I have performed. Many another person I have put into trances similar to yours, and for longer periods of time, too, and there has been no harm, nay, nor physical exhaustion from it. Alas, the alchemist moaned as if making a confession, I have been in trances other than those of your making, and almost continually, too. What? Tring leaped to his feet in astonishment. What do you say? You have been in trances induced by others? Other men share our secrets, then. Who may it be that is also a master of this rare craft? I had thought that no others save I in this town were able to bring about such trances. He glared at Kreutz with open hatred and let his fingers stray as well to the handle of a short knife that he carried in his belt, for although he was but a young man, he took his occult powers very seriously. There was as well an element of fear in his emotions, since the civil authorities of that day dealt usually in short and severe fashion with persons brought before magistrates on the charge of indulging in dark or occult practices. Death even was prescribed as punishment for some, although disfiguring, whipping, stocks, and banishment were the most common penalties. Tring's powers, though mysterious in those days, could be easily explained in ours. The so-called trances into which certain persons have the power to send others we call in these times merely hypnotic sleep. Hypnotism in the days when all men and women were to an extent superstitious was looked upon as one of the very worst works of a malignant devil upon earth. Tring possessed to some extent the ability to summon hypnotic sleep to a willing patient, and the alchemist had become a too willing patient in his endeavor to discover the secret that Tring had made appear so desirable. And, as is the case with most practitioners of hypnotism and their subjects, the hypnotist had gained, little by little, more and more power over his co-worker, until in a few months the alchemist had become merely a tool in the hands of Tring, who, knowing his ability and scholarly accomplishments, did not hesitate to use them for his own ends. He did this, however, with great caution, and enjoined ever upon the alchemist the need for the utmost secrecy, for if it had become known that such tricks were being practiced, the law would make short shrift of both. No man, answered the wretched alchemist, no man, but perhaps devils. Tring stood motionless, thunderstruck. Was the alchemist losing his mind? Yes, devils. I can stand it no longer. The alchemist rose from his stool and turned upon Tring. You who have powers greater than man know most of what is passing in my soul. The secrets of my craft, the sciences of actions and reactions, all these you know. But I hold from you one secret, one great secret which has bowed my shoulders with care and blackened my heart with crime. Come watch, I will show you something that has powers beyond those of which you dream. See. His accents became wilder and his voice trembled. He shuffled about the attic as if making preparations for some experiment. He set up a tripod in the very middle of the room and linked the top with chains as if he were to set a bowl upon it. He unlocked a great chest that stood in one corner under the eaves and took from it some object wrapped in black cloths, and this object he placed upon the tripod. Now let us have a light, he said. He shook some powder into a brazier full of coals which suddenly leaped into flame. As the whole room burst into existence with the illumination, there appeared most prominently in it the tripod which bore the covered mystery. The alchemist whipped the cloth covering away. It was as if he had uncovered a diamond of the finest water. Upon the brass top of the tripod gleamed in that instant a very miracle of color and light. The object itself was about the size of a man's head. Upon this exquisite thing no artificial effort of man had been expended. It was as nature had fashioned it in the depths of some subterranean grotto where drops of water falling in steady succession for thousands and thousands of years had slowly created it. The outer layers were clear like the water of a mountain spring. As the eye fell farther and farther within the surface, a bluish tint was perceptible, and at the very center there was a coloring of rose. Such was its absolute beauty that whoever looked into its depths seemed to be gazing into a sea without limit. "In the name of heaven," shrieked Tring, "what is this?" The alchemist spoke in a low voice, as one might speak in a church. "The great Tarnov Crystal." "The great Tarnov Crystal," repeated Tring. "The great Tarnov Crystal." "Why, that is the stone for which alchemists and workers of magic have been searching these hundreds of years." "The great Tarnov Crystal!" He shouted it almost in high excitement. "Why, man, we have here the greatest scientific treasure of all ages." He began to skip about in transports as the possibilities of the treasure's possession leaped into his mind. "And now I understand," he continued. "Indeed, you have been under the hand of a devil if you have been gazing into that thing. Why, do you know that this stone can send a man into a trance in which all manner of truths will be divulged? Do you know that we can learn now for a certainty the very secret that we have been seeking?" And going close to the stone, he gazed into its depths as a thirsty man might gaze into a well of water. There was this curious property of the great Tarnov crystal, and perhaps of all great crystals in the world's history, that it never presented the same vista twice to the man who looked within its depths. Now this may have been due to many things, to the fact that the lights surrounding it were never twice the same, and also perhaps to this, that the crystal had the strange property of reflecting back to the observer the very thoughts that were tucked away deeply in his head. What drew men to the Tarnov crystal in the beginning was, of course, its beauty, its color, its light, its constantly changing vistas, and besides these there was that indefinable fascination that all such stones have. Diamonds as well possess this fascinating power to a high degree, though the diamond is, of course, a small stone, and not large enough to hold the concentrated focus of two eyes for a very long time. The crystal, by reason of its size, possesses this quality according to its fineness. The Tarnov crystal was the finest crystal known to the magicians of the Middle Ages. And although magic was frowned upon by scholars and men of science such as astronomers and alchemists, still there was no distinct line between science and magic, with the result that many of these men found themselves practicing magic when they had intended only to make scientific investigations. It was even so with Pankreutz, who ordinarily had but little use for magic or the black arts in any form. Until now, he had come entirely under the domination of the student Tring, whose enthusiasm had carried him away. "I tell you that I have had enough," the alchemist repeated now. "I have perjured my soul to obtain this stone, and I am ready to return it to its rightful owners. This stone is a thing of wickedness and blood, and it has a woeful history, as old perhaps as the world itself." "Return it!" shouted Tring. "Return it! Why, Pankreutz, listen to my reasoning. I know not how you have come by this thing. I do not ask at present. But you would be scarce the man I took you for, did you not use it for the purpose that we need it. After that we may return it. If indeed it has been stolen, or if it sticks within your conscience to retain it now, then perhaps I—" "Nay, nay, Johann Tring," exclaimed the alchemist emphatically. "To its rightful owners it shall go. Here I have kept the secret to myself, knowing that the knowledge would tempt you, and indeed you would not have known now unless the secret had burned so heavily in my brain." "As you will," said Tring, humoring the alchemist with his concession, though the purpose in his eyes was of different intent. "But first let us learn from it at once how to transmute baser metals into gold. This I am sure we shall do. Then we can be independent of these smirking dogs who rule the universities." "Then let our experiments be brief," said the alchemist. "I have looked too long upon this glittering thing. You should have told me before." Tring again adopted the attitude of a kindly adviser. "But in truth," went on the alchemist, "I doubt if we can wring that secret from the crystal. I have now an opinion, though perhaps a wrong one, that the crystal only gives us back our own thoughts. We may not call upon it as upon some friendly spirit to tell us what we do not know. We may not wish and have our wishes fulfilled. I begin to doubt it all." Here he rose to his feet and began to stride about the floor. "It is already having a bad influence upon me. I cannot see straightly in the world of men as once I did. When I have looked into it for minutes and minutes, my thoughts come back to me crookedly, and while I have taken much interest in such contemplation, I find that there is too deadly a fascination in gazing into those crystal depths. I have, as I said, found much of interest, and were I alone in the world, I might even pursue these studies to the very limits of human thought, but I sometimes feel as if my very soul were getting caught in the rays of that bright thing." "Might I ask," inquired Tring, unable to restrain his curiosity longer, "how the crystal came into your possession?" "It was like this." The alchemist willingly relieved his mind of the secret that he had been bearing alone. "That night when the thieves came here some time ago, I entertained them for a bit with some Greek fire and nitre. Yes, it seems that the crystal was at that time in the possession of the family in the rooms below ours." "What?" "The trumpeter and the boy who bear the name Kowalski. Yes, though that is not their name. They are Charnetskys and lived formerly in the Ukraine." "I see. And the thieves?" "Tartars and Cossacks who followed them perhaps from the Dnieper country. Yes, the crystal was actually in the hands of the leader when I surprised him with an explosive powder. In the surprise and pain occasioned by my attack, he dropped the crystal. The powder blazed about his face and burned his hair. The crystal rolled upon the floor, and I pounced upon it." "But how had it come into the possession of the Charnetsky family?" asked Tring eagerly. "It was in this fashion. When the Tartars devastated the Polish country in the 13th century, the village that stood where now is Tarnov was inhabited by the Charnetskys, among others, of course. It was Andrew Charnetsky of that day who performed heroic feats in the defense of the city against the Tartars, and to him was presented for safekeeping the great crystal which has come to be known as the Great Tarnov Crystal. It was the chief ornament of the old town, and even kings had come there to see it. For besides its qualities as a thing of rare value and beauty, it had those reputed properties you have mentioned, that a man who looked into it might there read the secrets of the past and the future, that he might find out the intimate thoughts of other men and women, that he might learn to overcome the elements, to fly through the air like a bird, to walk invisibly, to transmute base metals into gold. In those times no man was allowed to look more than 3 minutes upon it, for even in 3 minutes a man might find his head swimming and curious thoughts coming into his brain. But how did the Charnetskys save it from the Tartars? They fled with it to the Carpathian Mountains, and remained there until Batu the Tartar was forced to return to the land of the Golden Horde. Then, as it passed from eldest son to eldest son, it went to an ancestor of this Andrew Charnetsky, who settled in the Ukraine after the country had been put under Polish dominion in the days of Władysław Jagiello. Of course, the name Andrew Charnecki is by no means an uncommon one throughout Poland. So little did I think when this man came into the humble lodgings below that he belonged to the Charnecki family which had possession of the Tarnov Crystal. Did he tell you his story? Yes. On the day after the crystal disappeared, he made a confidant of me as one already acquainted with his name and a part of his history. But you had heard of the crystal before. What alchemist has not? He answered. I knew that it was brought in early days to Egypt from somewhere in the east, and there it stood in a temple for many centuries. When the Romans conquered Egypt, the crystal was taken to Rome. During the years when the Romans were colonizing the lands around the Black Sea, a certain Roman officer fell in love with a woman of Transylvania, and being sent there with a legion, stole for her this crystal from a temple in Rome. When his crime was discovered, the emperor sent a detachment of soldiers to bring him back, but he fled to the district which is now Halitz, but which went then under the Roman name Galicia. There he lived with his wife under an assumed name in a remote village later known as Tarnov, and there the crystal remained up to the time that it passed into the hands of the Charneckis. Around it grew up a sect of sorcerers, magicians, practitioners of the black art, astrologers and alchemists, some sincere, others mere charlatans. Surely there have been many attempts to steal the crystal from the Charneckis? Only one. It seems that men, even alchemists and astrologers, lost for a time the thread of its history, and it was only when a runaway servant of Andrew Charnecki spread the news in the East that it was in his possession that an attempt was made to find it. That attempt, as you know, cost Pan Andrew his house and property in the Ukraine. Who it is that is inciting these robbers I know not, but I have no doubt that the leader of the band was in the pay of some person in high authority. Would the robbers taken prisoners say nothing? No, they did not know all, I believe, and like most Tartars they would rather die than betray a secret. Torture could not wring it out of them. Does Pan Andrew suspect that you have the crystal? Pan Andrew considers me his friend, and at heart I am ashamed and sick that I have not restored it before now. But think, if it had not been for you, the Cossack would have escaped with the crystal and it would have been lost forever. I know it, yet that is no justification for me. I stole it, if a thief ever stole anything. When I first saw it that night on the floor of Pan Andrew's lodging, I would have exchanged my chance of heaven for its possession. When I had obtained it, and the attention of the crowd in the court below was turned to the robbers and to the man escaping over the roofs, I brought it here to the loft, under my coat. You did well, said Tring, the wildest impulses of excitement leaping within him. Look at the crystal. It glows and dances and quivers like a thing alive, ready to tell its secrets. Quick, draw your chair near to it as you used to draw your chair to me when I was the master of your trances. Gaze deeply into it. He fixed the hesitating alchemist with his eyes as a serpent might fix a helpless bird, and now let us try the greatest experiment of all. The alchemist pulled his chair close to the crystal as he was bid, and fixed his eyes upon it. Tring watched him closely from a distance. 1 minute. 2 minutes, 3. The alchemist still looked at the crystal, and Tring regarded him as a cat might regard a mouse that it was playing with. 4 minutes, 5. The alchemist still sat motionless, but his posture in the chair was changing slightly. His arms and neck seemed to be stiffening. His face was taking on the look of an entirely different person. His breath came regularly, but in longer and deeper draughts than was his wont. His eyes became wide open and staring. Listen! Tring's tone was sharp, commanding. I am listening, the reply came instantly. Tring trembled with excitement. Not only had the alchemist gone into this trance more quickly than he, Tring, had ever been able to send him, but he was still responsive to the student who had feared lest the agency of the crystal might render Kreutz unresponsive to him. But Tring had sent him into trances so many times that now his mind seemed to answer the student's bidding automatically. Tell me what you see. I can see a huge hall like an alchemist's room, filled with braziers and glass instruments. In these instruments fluids of fire are rushing to and fro, and near them are great copper kettles out of which are coming puffs of steam.
It is the devil's workshop that you are in,
said Tring sharply. Do you see any men at work? There was silence a moment as the alchemist's consciousness went roaming through the vast room. There is no one here, he said at length. Are there any manuscripts there? Demanded Tring. Silence again. Then, yes, on the wall hangs a parchment. Take it down. It burns my hands. Pay no heed to that. Your reward will be greater than your pains. It is in my hands. Tring glanced involuntarily at the hands of the man in the trance. Curiously enough, they seemed to be turning red, as if exposed to a great heat. Now read what the parchment says, the alchemist replied, slowly as if reading, and he spoke in the Latin tongue. Here may one find things which be neither good nor evil, but which are sought of all men. Good! Now unroll the parchment. There was another silence. At length the alchemist said, I have found somewhat. Read. Nay, I may not. It is in symbols. Then write. Tring deftly slipped a piece of board across his knees and put into his fingers a kind of pen made of wood and a feather. This he had dipped into a pot of ink as thick as paint, and he guided it in the alchemist's hand until it rested upon a piece of fresh white parchment that he laid upon the board. The alchemist wrote as follows. What else? The alchemist wrote, Quod primum incredibile, non continuo falsum este crebro siquidem faciem mendaci veritas retinet. No, that's nothing. Do you find other formula? The alchemist looked closely and recited as if reading. Thus saith Olympiodorus of Thebes, Osthenes the Egyptian, Celos of Byzantium, and Geober of Arabia, heat the fires upon thy brazier, and place thereon a vessel full of yellow sulphur. This thou shalt melt until it gives forth a spirit. When the spirit is departed, pour slowly upon the sulphur that quicksilver which has its birth in the planet Mercury. In but the twinkling of an eye this will be reduced from its natural state unto a state that is of the earth, black, without life, dead. Then take this lifeless substance and put it in a closed vessel, heat it, and it will suddenly take on life again and become a brilliant red. Write it, exclaimed Tring. The alchemist wrote, And is there more? Much. It saith here that this is the secret of the 7 golden chapters, of the emerald table and the pomander. Natura naturam superat, deinde vero natura congaude, tandem natura naturam continet. No more of that. That is vile philosophy, shouted Tring. Find and write the completion of the philosopher's stone, by which we may convert brass into gold. The alchemist continued, Zosimus the Theban directs that this is the true method of turning brass into gold. To the above heated solution of sulphur and mercury, add that pure nitre which men find in the heart of India. Into this cast brass, and it will in a moment change to gold. Quick, to work. Light the braziers and bring out sulphur, quicksilver, and brass, commanded Tring. Have you any of this Indian nitre? I have. A small packet on the 3rd shelf of the closet, answered the alchemist. Tring rushed to get it and set all the materials ready for the experiment. Truly and sincerely did he believe that the alchemist had hit upon the solution of the much-desired process of changing base metals into gold, and his own lack of knowledge in the realm of the science of alchemy was responsible for the ignorance with which he ordered the alchemist to compound one of the most dangerous chemicals known to man. The alchemist, on his part, was but acting under the hypnotic suggestion of Tring, and had no opportunity to interpose his normal self-sense between the student's intention and its execution. Indeed, the information he had during the trance came from his own fund of learning, although the suggestion of adding niter to the heated compound was but a fancy of a mind grown either tired or weak. As the student hurried about arranging materials for the experiment, Kreutz sang a Latin hymn which extols the practice of alchemy and the alchemist. In exhaustium fert thesaurem, qui divergis facit aurum gemmas de lapidibus. Compound the philosopher's stone, commanded Tring. The alchemist, still in the trance, arose and leaned over the brazier. Something flaky and white and inflammable was tucked close to the bottom to act as kindling, and a coal brought from a farther brazier and laid upon this. It turned all black for a minute, then sizzled into an intense heat and ignited the brazier's contents. The flame was at first yellow and creeping, then it changed to blue and leaping. Kreutz put a vessel filled with sulfur into the flames, and sure enough, in a moment the spirit of the sulfur arose in fumes that filled the room. Both leaned over the brazier eagerly as the alchemist shook mercury over the melted sulfur. As the parchment had decreed, so the reaction followed. In a short time the glittering mercury had mingled with the melted sulfur and became an ugly black substance. Tring handed to Kreutz another vessel which was closed at the top. Kreutz shook the hot material from the first vessel into the second and put the latter back on the brazier. In all his motions, he acted mechanically as if he were but working out the will of another. He opened this second vessel after a few seconds, and, sure enough, the black substance was becoming a lively red. "The niter! The niter!" exclaimed Tring eagerly at his elbow. The alchemist took the package from his hands and tossed it into the substance now seething with heat. As he did so, as if obeying some unconscious instinct of self-preservation, he leaped back into the middle of the room and drew Tring with him. The exclamation of anger on Tring's lips was cut in half, for at that instant the loft of the house rocked in a terrific explosion. "Quick, seize the crystal and descend!" screamed Tring, who was already speeding through the doorway, frantically wiping sparks of fire from his clothing. The exploding substances had sent their flames into the dry roof and walls of the house, and fire was leaping through them merrily. Everything in the room was beginning to blaze, and in 2 minutes more it would have been impossible to leave. The alchemist, still in a daze, took the crystal as he had been commanded and made for the stairway. The stone gleamed in his hands like 1,000,000 diamonds, rubies, and emeralds where the flames fell upon it, and he clutched it with all the strength of his right hand as he clung to the stair rail with his left, now swaying out over the court like a drunken man, now regaining his hold and descending another stair. But the student had been more nimble, and by the time that the alchemist had descended to the 3rd floor of the house, Johann was down the stairs and through the gate, calling with all his might for the watch to notify the watermaster that the house above him was in flames. No watch was in sight, and so he sought one at full speed, and while he was searching, Kreutz had reached the open door and disappeared in the night, the great Tarnov Crystal hidden under the folds of his black gown. But behind him the flames had eaten through the roof of his house and had leaped to the adjoining house. In a few minutes they had bounded clear across an open court nearby and had laid hold of one of the pensions of the university. The wind then veering swept the flames in a seething mass in the direction of the great Rheineck, and in less than 15 minutes after the flight of the 2 men from the loft of the building, the university section of Krakow was in the grip of a terrible conflagration that threatened to devour the whole city. Chapter 14. A Great Fire Rages. Since earliest times, Krakow was divided into 4 sections: the castle quarter, the potter's quarter, the butcher's quarter, and the Slavkov. At the head of each of these districts was a quartermaster who was responsible for everything that went on in his district, the fighting of fires being one of his chief concerns. Therefore the watchman from one of the streets that lay in the districts threatened by the fire went pounding at the gate of the quartermaster's house, shouting, "Fire!" at the top of his lungs in order to send the servants flying to the master. In a short time the quartermaster was up and dressed, and had sent summons to the watermaster who had charge of the town reservoir and aqueducts. The bell meanwhile began to sound clamorously from the tower of the church of Our Lady Mary, for the watchman there had caught sight of the flames. Cries of fire were now being echoed from all sections of the city, and in the red glare which was beginning to illumine all the grim Gothic buildings and churches, a very tumult of confusion was arising. The watermaster had already set his machinery in motion, and drummers were pounding away at their drums in all the city streets in order to awaken the merchants and their apprentices, upon whom fell the burden of fighting the flames. All the town guilds were assembling. Companies of servants from the palaces were filling buckets of water and taking positions on the roofs of their own houses, and all citizens were busily getting down from the wall hooks and axes and pails such as the law required them to keep for such emergencies. A fire of any size in Krakow was a serious thing in those days, for there were hundreds upon hundreds of wooden and part-wooden houses clustered together in the thickly populated streets. In the section about the old university, the majority of dwellings were very ancient, dry, and cobwebbed everywhere, and a single spark upon their roofs was enough to turn them in exceedingly rapid fashion into belching furnaces of flame and smoke. As the fire raced through these streets, the inhabitants poured out in panic-stricken confusion. Each building was literally teeming with life, and the whole scene, viewed from above, would have resembled a huge ant-hill suddenly destroyed or burned out by a careful gardener. Women and children came out rushing and shrieking. Black-robed students dashed through the streets with manuscripts and parchments in their hands. Others came carrying glass tubes or astrolabes or metal dividers. Frantic domestics ran here and there with no definite refuge in view, save only to escape the heat and terror of the ever-spreading flames. The streets were rapidly filling with furniture, clothing, beds, and personal possessions of every variety, hurled out of casements by desperate owners, and some of this material in the streets had already caught fire from the sparks which were descending like rain in a spring thunderstorm, making the lot of the fugitives even more unendurable. Inside some of the courts, those who had preserved presence of mind were combating the fire with much vigor. Tubs of water and pails were being pressed into action, and burning walls were already being hauled down. The watermaster had marshaled a line of water carts which extended from the burning buildings to the aqueduct. These water carts were usually drawn by horses, and some of them were on this night. But there had been difficulty in getting enough horses quickly, and men and boys were harnessed into the shafts. At the aqueduct, men were busy filling the carts with water. As each cart was filled, it moved on some little distance to the fire, and there being emptied, swung about into another street and returned to the aqueduct for another filling. The nearest section of the aqueduct was about 1/8 of a mile from the point where the fire started. Forces of men armed with hooks and axes were sent out by the watermaster to surround the district where the flames were reaching, for the rapid spread of the fire had made it apparent at an early stage that very little could be saved in the university area. These men were under orders to demolish any building that seemed to offer a chance for a further spread of the blaze, whether the fire had already reached it or not. One detachment formed a line in front of the Church of the Franciscans, another on St. Anne's Street, and another on Bracca. All these detachments were forced to retreat, however, as the fire ate its way out of the district where it had started. The Rheineck was the scene of a turbulent mob which had struggled from the burning section in the Street of the Pigeons, and every open space was quickly filled with rescued goods. 2 families had even taken possession of the platform where the town pillory stood, and children were being put to sleep there by mothers thankful to find a place of rest. Amid all this uproar, an elderly woman, a boy, a girl, and a dog were fighting their way through the Street of the Pigeons amidst the debris of furniture and personal belongings that had been thrown from windows. They had all been sleeping when the fire broke out, and not having been roused until the flames were all about them, had been able to rescue nothing but themselves and the clothes which they wore. The boy was Joseph, the girl Elzbietekka, and the woman the wife of Pan Andrew. Wolf, cut loose by Joseph, was the most terror-stricken of the group, but he followed after them, submissive and obedient, not knowing exactly what he was expected to do. Each of them was busy with separate thoughts as they fought their way through the disorder. Joseph was ever figuring the quickest route out of the burning district, and this was no easy task, since the fire was playing so many tricks. It was not marching ahead in a straight wall of flame, but was whirling about, leaping here and there, skipping this house and fastening upon that, advancing, retreating, spreading to the flanks, all with terrific speed and unexpected vivacity. Sometimes the two roofs just above the heads of the fugitives would shoot up in flames. Passing these with great peril, they would find that the fire was now behind them and rejoice at the breath of air that fell upon them. Then suddenly, without warning, the roof of a building just ahead would belch forth smoke and flame, as if the fire demon were working invisibly, and this new peril must be passed. At length they reached a place where the Street of the Pigeons is cut by a cross lane known today as Wilna Street. But this lane was already full of smoking beams and fallen timbers. Escape that way was impossible. There was nothing to do but to push on through the Street of the Pigeons, where it curves to meet Bracca. Elzbietka was wondering most of all about her uncle. There had been no answer to their hurried calls when they left the doomed house, and, besides, the loft was glowing in red and purple flames of such intensity that no person alive could have been there at that time. Joseph's mother was thinking of the father, wondering if he had left his post at the church to come to his family's aid, and wondering, too, if they could reach him at the tower before he began to suffer too much from anxiety concerning them. The houses were a little higher in this portion of the street, and there was therefore more cool air in the lower reaches. The fire was still whirling along here, but was not taking hold quite so fast as it had done down below, and consequently the fugitives made better progress. The only difficulty was the ever-increasing crowd that now swept in from three directions, making it hard for the three to keep together. Finally, they locked arms and literally fought their way through the crowd. All about them the scenes were heart-rending, men and women fleeing with but few possessions from the only homes they had ever known, children lost in the mad scramble who set up shrill cries and tried to keep their feet as the crowd pushed ahead. Sick persons were brought into that raging torrent of humanity, carried on the shoulders of their relatives or perhaps stretched upon cots. Here was one old man who sat astride a young fellow's neck like Anchises on the back of Aeneas, fleeing from the burning city of Ilium. At length they stood where the fire had not reached, much more fortunate in that than many other people that night. Joseph waited only until they caught their breath, though he too felt like throwing himself down upon the ground and resting, and then started forward again through Bracca in the direction of the Rheineck. In his heart he hoped that when he had settled Elzbietka and his mother in the tower where his father was on duty, he might come back with the apprentices and help fight the fire, for there is that in a youth which draws him into such fighting. As they went along Bracca he heard the sound of horses' hoofs from the direction of the Wawel. "Wait," he said, drawing the women back on a footpath. "Here come soldiers from the castle to preserve order." He spoke truly, for the next moment a great troop of cavalry wearing mail armor and carrying spears rode into Bracca Street from below and began to deploy in lines that marked the district immediately threatened by fire. A few minutes later, foot soldiers and artisans began to appear and, joining with the watch, pulled down buildings at the edge of the fire. Siege machinery was also drawn up into Bracca, and the buildings just outside the reach of the fire began to crumble under its pounding. "This will prevent the spread of the flames," thought Joseph. They went ahead again toward the church, but while they were still in the Rheineck, they saw a company of soldiers dragging forward a prisoner whom they had taken in the burning district. "A thief!" said the boy. "Bless us!" exclaimed the mother. It is not possible that men could be so cruel as to steal from poor folk driven mad with terror. As the company came near and the torches fell upon the face of the prisoner, Joseph let out a cry of amazement. "Why, mother, that is Peter of the button face, the leader of the men that attacked our house. That is the man who met us on the first day we were in Krakow. He it was who tried to make us prisoners in the church tower. See how he struggles, but they are holding him tight for all that. And, mother, it is not the city watch that has taken him. It is the king's own guard. Do you not see the royal crown on their helmets? Do you not notice the richness of their clothing? I wonder what it can be about." Joseph spoke truly. Peter had at last fallen into the hands of guardians of the law, and this time it was the king's own men that held him. It was evident, too, from the way they held him that they thought they had a prize. They did not stop at the townhouse where offenders against municipal law were kept, but marched straight along Castle Street in the direction of the royal castle on Wowell Hill. At the church they found Pan Andrew in a very sweat of anxiety and fear lest something of harm had befallen them. He caressed them all one after another and then said to Joseph earnestly, "I want you to remain here and sound the hynals for the rest of the night. There is much work to be done in the quarter where the fire is, and every man's hand is needed to stay the flames." "I see that Pan Kreutz is not with you. He stayed too, I presume, to work with the rest of the men?" "Indeed, father, I know not." "We called many times, but his loft was a mass of flames like to a roaring furnace when we were driven down the stairs. I must see, then, if I can find aught of him. He has been on a previous occasion our very great benefactor, and it would but suit us ill not to seek at least his body in the ruins. Should he not have perished, as I pray God he has not, then we can offer him shelter here until such time as he can find a roof again." But when Joseph told him of the capture of Peter, he looked very serious and said that if such people were in the city, then he had better not leave his wife and the young people. On second thought, however, it seemed right for him to go, for the city was now lighted by flames, and it would be easy to summon aid if they were attacked. And so he, with thousands of other valiant men, fought the fire in Krakow that night. They formed in a ring about the conflagration and tore down all the buildings across which it might run. The Collegium Minus was the last building to catch on the side toward the city wall, and then the fighters tore down the houses near the old Jew gate and stopped the fire there. The flames swept around the other buildings of the university, destroyed one or two, though not all, and were finally halted on the second street above St. Anne's. Sweeping in the other direction, the fire had early in its progress destroyed the monastery and adjoining houses of the Church of the Franciscans, and had crossed over to Castle Street, where it burned flat a whole line of buildings. On these and the other edges of the district, a wide belt of destruction was created by the fighters. This belt, the tradesmen, running to and fro with water wagons filled constantly at the aqueduct, wet down and soaked until it was almost a water wall. So furiously had they worked that the main progress of the fire was checked in 7 or 8 hours, and although certain buildings and ruins smoked and even blazed for several days afterward, yet the great danger passed when this well-soaked belt of destruction was completed. When Pan Andrew returned to the tower in the full blaze of the morning sun, nearly 1/3 of the city of Krakow lay in ruins. Fortunately, it was not the better portion of the city, and many of the old wooden-built hovels had been there since before the days of Casimir the Great. That monarch had successfully converted about 1/2 the city of Krakow from wood to stone more than 100 years before. Had he not done so, it is probable that the fire of 1462 might have utterly consumed it. Elsbietka and Joseph's mother were asleep on the trumpeter's bed, clasped in each other's arms. Joseph sat outside the compartment with the hourglass before him on a beam, gazing out over the smoking ruins of the university quarter. Is the city saved? Was the first question he asked his father.
It is not now in danger, answered Pan Andrew.
But there are many homeless souls in the city this day. Did you see the alchemist? I did not. He has disappeared as if he had flown away on the clouds of smoke that covered the city.
Poor Elzbieta, exclaimed Joseph.
The girl inside the compartment moaned slightly as her name was spoken, although she was deep in a heavy slumber.
I wonder if he was caught in the loft, mused Pan Andrew.
It was in the very center of the burned district.
The answer to his question came with sudden unexpectedness. There was a sound of footsteps on the stairs, and Jan Kanti's head appeared from below. The scholar was leading another man by the arm, a man who had been in the fire. His charred clothes and blackened face showed it. Around his shoulders and falling to his waist was all that remained of what had once been a black robe. He kept his hands beneath this robe.
"Pan Andrew," whispered Jan Kanti softly, "I have found in the street Pan Kreutz." And, checking the other's startled exclamation, he explained, "He is not in his right senses. Something has affected his brain, but he has here something of interest to us all." Pan Andrew turned toward Kreutz. He never would have recognized him had not Jan Kanti identified him. Joseph felt his eyes glued with strange eagerness upon the eerie, blackened figure and the mysterious folded hands beneath the robe. It had been a scholar's robe once.
"Ha ha ha ha," laughed the alchemist suddenly. "Up to heaven goes everything in fire, and yet no gold is found anywhere. Johann Tring." He looked about anxiously. "Where is Johann Tring? He answers me not. He is lost in the flames that came so red and purple when niter mixed with charcoal. Oho, Johann Tring! Come, Johann Tring, and see what I have carried this whole long night for you." Throwing back the black robe, he held up the object that he had been concealing there, and at the same moment the sun, streaming in through the little window on the east side, fell full upon that object, fell upon it and made it sparkle like the myriad of dew diamonds shining upon a morning lawn. New mode, sparkled like the 1,000 chandeliers in the king's great hall in the palace on the Wawel Hill, sparkled like the rubies and emeralds that gleam in the queen's crown, sparkled like the wondrous thing that it was, all touched by the red rays of the morning sun, the great Tarnov Crystal. "Now whence has that come?" shouted Pan Andrew so loudly that the sleepers in the next room awoke. "Where by all that is good and holy in the world have you found the gem which has been in my family for years and years, which all my ancestors and I have sworn to guard forever, and to surrender to no person except to the King of Poland? How has it come into your hands after it was stolen from me, and my heart was nearly broken? Did you get it perhaps from that ruffian who has been captured by the king's guards? Did you find it perhaps in the ruins of the town? Did you, perchance—" The truth suddenly flashed upon him, and he was speechless. "It is an accursed thing," cried out the alchemist suddenly, reeling in Jan Kanti's arms as if he were gone faint. "There is blood upon it, and fire. It has lured princes and kings to their destruction. It has made men's brains mad with lust for want of it. It has caused good men to steal and evil men to kill. I will have none of it. I will have none of it, I say." He was growing almost boisterous, yet there was something in this attack of madness that had much of reason and determination in it. "I will have no more of it," he repeated, "and no more of Johann Tring." At that he fell fainting to the floor. Jan Kanti raised him, and Elzbieta, who had run out from the trumpeter's room, rushed to him and kissed and fondled his blackened hands. Pan Andrew picked up the great Tarnov Crystal and held it at arm's length with a smile. "Now may peace come upon us all," he said, "for I may fulfill the oath that my family has taken and deliver this to the king." While the secret of its hiding place remained with me, I might keep the crystal as long as I chose. But now that the secret is out, there is but one place where it may be guarded safely, and that is in the palace of the king. Pankreuz is right. This jewel has already done too much harm in the world. Then you may rid yourself of it at once, broke in John Canty. The king returned to Krakow 2 days ago, and we may find him at the castle this very morning. Chapter 15. King Kazimir Jagiello. Of all the wonders that the capital city of Poland possessed, Joseph knew of none that stirred his imagination more than did this royal castle of the kings upon the Wawel. Impregnable through many sieges, its great rock base had stood, brick and stone heaped high above it in a great mass of towers, turrets, and walls. At its very heart, high above the winding Vistula and the town, stood a strangely built round tower enclosed and protected by the palace wings, where men in prehistoric times worshipped the old nature gods of the Slavs, a place of rest and seclusion where on rare occasions, when townsfolk might visit the castle, Joseph had stood thinking of things that had been in the old days. He knew well the legend of Krakow, the hero of the Dark Ages, who slew a dragon that had once made this hill his habitation. There was a cave, so Joseph heard, that ran from the fortress underground beneath the river, a secret exit in time of siege. Here had been the dragon's lair until the hero overcame him, and from that day men made the Wawel a home, from which might be seen climbing into the air spires and belfries. All this Joseph had seen. He had fed his fancies upon every object that graced the bleak, majestic rock, and yet there remained one glory that had never yet met his eyes. That glory was Poland's king. But this morning, after the fire, when the little company set out from the church of Our Lady Mary toward the Wawel Hill, Joseph felt his heart leaping strangely in his breast at the thought of the adventure that was to be theirs. To see the king, to have audience before him, it made the blood sing in his ears and tingle in his fingertips. They took the alchemist with them, on Jan Kanti's advice, although he still seemed like a man in a dream. "I found him wandering through the fire-swept streets early this morning," said the scholar. "He had been running hither and thither all night long in the most dangerous parts of the city, and how he has escaped death from falling timbers and burning coals is more than I know. The man has something on his mind, something that troubles him hugely, and with it all he seems to be acting like one in a spell." "Do you think it well to bring him with us?" asked Pan Andrew, who had doubted from the beginning that there would be any benefit from the man's presence. "Yes, I have a curious notion," answered the scholar, "that he may be able to help us. We have much to explain to the king, and the man's presence will make our story more credible. And who knows, perhaps the alchemist himself may get help. He needs some light thrown into that brain of his, and since he is harmless, it will do no damage to take him." Pankreuz's hands and face had been washed and dried, and most of the fire grime had left him. The scholar's robe was useless, however, and Pan Andrew hung a kontus or long coat about his shoulders. Joseph was there with the 3 men. Wolf had been left behind, sleeping upon the floor of the high tower room. Joseph's mother and Elzbietka were under the protection of the day watchman who relieved Pan Andrew at dawn. It was necessary for Pan Andrew and Jan Kanti to assist the alchemist in walking at times, when his feet would shuffle curiously like those of a man walking in his sleep, but he plodded along bravely, not yet realizing quite clearly what was happening about him, yet confident that the 2 men near him were his friends and were leading him to some good place. From Castle Street they turned at length up the long slope leading to the castle on the Wawel. Behind them lay street after street of desolation, of smoking ruins, of masses of wood still flaming. Amidst these ruins men were still working valorously, tearing down charred beams and hurling in tons and tons of water from the water wagons, which were now all drawn by horses. One side of Castle Street had suffered badly. The houses on the Street of the Pigeons were entirely destroyed. Saint. Anne Street had but few buildings left, while much devastation had been done along the Street of the Bakers, the Street of the Goldsmiths, and the Street of the Jews and Broad Street. Giancanti's company was challenged twice by guards on the way to the palace, but when the soldiers recognized the good father, they were at once passed along without question. It was another proof to Joseph of the esteem in which the man was held. In himself, however, there was not the least indication of pride and ostentation. He was as simple as a child in most matters affecting worldly things, and yet his name was as magic even in the court of the king. At length they all stood in the little passageway on the Wawel through which one passes to the palace, and here the guard, with spear raised in salute to the scholar, bade the company wait until he went to see if an audience might be had. The soldier came back quickly. "The king," he said gravely, "will grant any request that may be made by Father Giancanti. He only begs that the company wait a few minutes until a present audience is finished." They waited perhaps 15 minutes, until an important-looking functionary in a blue robe came to announce that King Casimir Jaghiello would receive Giancanti and his friends. Out into a wide court they went, following the courtier in blue, up a marble staircase to the left and along a balcony. Then suddenly a door was flung back, and they were in the presence of the king. To Joseph, remembering it afterward, it all seemed like a dream. It was all so quiet and without ceremony. King Casimir had chosen to receive them in a small antechamber in which he often met certain persons who were to be received without the usual ceremony of presentation, and Giancanti was one of the privileged ones that he met in such fashion. Joseph and his father dropped upon one knee in front of the king. He was sitting in a high-backed chair without a canopy, which bore at its highest peak a royal crown. This crown was just above the monarch's head, so that at first it seemed as if it were actually upon his head and he were crowned. He wore a huge purple robe which fell clear to the tops of his soft leather sandals. It had a great collar embroidered with silks of many colors and in many patterns. A heavy gold chain held the folds of the collar together, and beneath the collar folds could be seen a rich vest embroidered with gold. The sleeves of the robe were immense, and hung down far below his knees as he sat there. The robe itself was fringed with heavy fur. His head covering was a simple cap of the same color as the robe, flat, soft, and turned up a trifle at each side. The king himself seemed the picture of comfort and informality, not so his guards. On each side of him stood a guard in plate armor, with stiff metal pieces over the arms, stomach, thighs, and legs. At the waist they wore short, straight swords ready for action at a second's notice. These two men were as motionless as statues. About the room stood knights in different kinds of armor, some in light chain with long skirt-like coats, some in mail jackets that resembled checkerboards in pattern and extended only from shoulder to thigh, some in heavy armor and metal shoes armed with spurs. In front of the king were two pages carrying scepters. They too stood motionless as he spoke. "What is this?" he asked, as Giancanti came forward to kiss his hand, which ceremony the king did not allow. "Have we here some poor city-dwellers driven forth by last night's fire?" "Yea," answered Giancanti, "that is true, though we come not on business of that sort. We are here upon some matter that may be of deeper interest than one would suppose. These are Pan Andrew and his son Joseph, by family named Charnetsky, dwellers of the Ukraine driven forth by violence and come here to have audience with your majesty." "So," said the king with quick interest. "Stand, if you please, and tell me the circumstances of your trouble, for it greatly interests me at this present time. I have much news from the Ukraine, and not so pleasant either. How came you by your misfortunes?" "If your majesty please," began Pan Andrew, rising and taking out the crystal from beneath his coat, "I wish to deliver to your highness the great Tarnov Crystal." The sunlight touched it as he held it up,
and the room and its splendid company were suddenly agleam with wavy flecks of light, red and orange and blue and yellow. There was a dazzling brilliance to it that struck each eye with almost the force of lightning. The king literally sprang forward to take the wondrous thing from Pan Andrew's hands. "What a marvel, what a thing of beauty!" he exclaimed, while a very murmur of astonishment ran through the circle of his attendants. "Where in the world is to be found any jewel one half so miraculous as this?" "I know not," answered Pan Andrew, "but it has been in the keeping of my family for many years." "Then why do you deliver it up to me?" demanded the king. "It is worth a quarter at least of all the treasures in this palace." "That I will explain. Day. My family has held it in trust these 200 years and more, and we have sworn to guard it until the secret of its hiding place became known, and then, since there would be great danger following such a discovery, to deliver it into the hands of the king." "Then its hiding place has been discovered? But tell me first the reason for concealing such a wondrous stone." "That, your majesty, is a long story, which, if your majesty so desires, I will deliver shortly in writing. But I may say briefly that when Tarnov fell before the Tartars these many years ago, the citizens entrusted this crystal to a member of my family. He took oath to guard it zealously, with his life if need be, lest it fall into the hands of people who might abuse its powers, for its beauty hides strange properties which are allied to magic and sorcery and the black arts, and it has been at times a curse, a thing of mystery and a source of evil. When Tarnov was rebuilt, new dwellers came there, and the crystal remained in our family. How did the secret become known? I had a servant, a Tartar. He was with me for many years. It was my custom to conceal the crystal in the rind of a pumpkin, and many a time this man must have seen me scraping out the inside of a pumpkin and rubbing the shell with oils and gum in order to preserve it. Because he was a simple fellow, I took no pains at any time to conceal my task. But though lacking in wit, it seems that the man was not lacking in curiosity. And his curiosity, I now believe, led him to spy upon me, and eventually he discovered the use to which I put the preserved pumpkin rind. He left me about a year ago, and it was only a few months later that my house was attacked. I am sure that he sold his information to some Tartar chieftain. Could he suspect the value of the crystal? That I do not know. I do know, however, that legends concerning this crystal are everywhere to be found among the Tartars and Cossacks. When they are children, they are told tales of it, and all of them grow up in the hope that someday they may find it. "Thou thing of beauty," said the king, gazing at the crystal, "could thou but speak and tell all that men have done to possess thee? Thou cruel, marvelous thing." Pan Andrew fell upon his knees before the king. "Take this crystal and guard it, your majesty," he exclaimed with great feeling, the tears already streaming down his face. "It has already done enough harm in the world. In my own family it has been nothing but a burden, a source of endless anxiety and suffering. My father's fathers, years and years ago, even dug a passageway in the earth, through which one might escape with it secretly in case of an attack, and so cleverly was this passage concealed that for years no one but the master of the family has known of its existence. In spite of the beauty of this jewel, I hate it from the very bottom of my heart, and I hope that I may never look upon it again. For every ray of light that it reflects, thousands of men have fought and died for its possession. For every color that lurks within its depths, miseries and sufferings have swept over whole nations. I have guarded it faithfully, but no more shall I guard it. I am fulfilled of my oath." The king looked into the crystal fixedly, and then suddenly shuddered as if he saw something fearful there. "I shall be before many years an old man," went on Pan Andrew in a pleading tone. "My home in the Ukraine exists no more.
My house is burnt, my fields are laid waste, and all because I had this jewel in my possession and men envied me." He then went on to tell the story of the escape from the Ukraine, the pursuit, the attempted robbery of his house, the attack on the tower, and the persistency and repeated appearances of Peter of the Button Face, whom he had heard of in the Ukraine as Bogdan the Terrible. "I do not know," he said, "who it might be that sent this man to dog my steps, but my son Joseph has told me that your guards have taken this same Peter a prisoner in the streets, and that he is a captive of your men. Let me confront him here, and perhaps I may learn who it was that drove me from the Ukraine." While he was speaking, the king gradually took his thoughts from off the crystal, and when he mentioned the name Peter, the king grew restless with excitement. "I have the man," he exclaimed, "and he shall be brought here. My spies in the Ukraine reported recently that a great treachery was afoot, and that this man Peter or Bogdan was in Poland for the purpose of consummating it. His description was given to my guards, and a reward was offered. Last night he was seen in the district where the fire was raging, and my guards brought him in. I shall have him here directly." 2 spearmen brought him in as he walked. The chains which hung from his arms and legs clanked on the floor. He did not deign at first to glance at Pan Andrew or any of his party, but simply looked at the king and folded his arms defiantly and with spirit, whereat the 2 guards forced him to his knees. His air of indifference disappeared, however, when his eyes fell upon the Tarnov Crystal which the king had set down upon the floor before him. He glanced left and right and favored the trumpeter and the alchemist with a look of bitter hatred. "You are accused of treason against the Commonwealth of Poland," said the king immediately. "Have you any plea to make? Who accuses me?" "The governors of the Ukraine," answered the king. "And moreover you are charged with other crimes, among them that of persecuting this citizen here before me. You have destroyed his home and fields, and attacked him while he was on duty in the church tower. The penalty for any one of these is death." Peter did not lose his self-assurance for a moment. He realized more quickly than another might that his plea of innocence would soon be broken down. He fell back then quickly upon another means of obtaining his end. "I would buy my freedom," he asserted. "What have you that is worthwhile to me?" asked the king. "March." "You are threatened in the Ukraine." The king thought for some minutes. It rather irked him to give this man his life, since he had already done such damage, but on the other hand he might be able to obtain some really valuable information. The whole Ukraine was in some kind of uproar, and even his most trusted spies had not been able to get to the bottom of it. The usual method of obtaining information from prisoners in those days was torture, and in the field of battle it was employed widely, but often in cases of such desperate men as Peter torture led them to confess wildly, but seldom with truth. The Cossack was ordinarily a man of his word, and Peter had enough Cossack blood in him to make him pass for a Cossack in the Ukraine and in the East. "It pleases me to be merciful today," replied the king. "There has been too much suffering at my very gates to make me wish for more. Your death would in no way pay for your crimes, and it is possible that your information might be of service to the Commonwealth. I could wrest this information from you by torture, but I prefer an easier way." "Now, Mark," he cautioned the Cossack, "I know certain facts concerning what you have to tell. I have information from my own men in the Ukraine, and if you utter so much as one word of a falsehood to me, I will have you taken out and hanged by the neck from the tower gate. Do you understand?" "I understand," answered Peter, turning just a trifle pale at the threat. He was a bold man, he was a desperate man, otherwise he would not have ventured back into Krakow after having been defeated there twice, and he had no fear of death in any form so long as he was free and able to fight. But now his knees smote together at the thought of hanging, and he resolved that he would keep close to the truth. After all, the whole affair was finished for him. The crystal was in the hands of the king, and he was not likely to part with it easily. One thing, he said in a low tone, one thing, your majesty, I beg, and that is that you will let none talk of what I say. For if it were known that I had spoken the truth, my life would not be worth that. He snapped his fingers. I have your promise, your majesty. You have. Then hear what I have to say. I am Bogdan, known in the Ukraine as the Terrible. 2 years ago in March I was summoned to Moscow by one in authority who said that a powerful lord had something to say to me. Now, having an open mind always for new activities, I went, although our people have but little love for Muscovites. And there I was, taken to one Ivan. The king interrupted. You mean... I mean Ivan himself, chief power among the Muscovites, son of that blind one. He has the ambition to unite all lands thereabouts under himself, as emperor, men say. The king bit his lips and his eyes flashed. This they have told me, he exclaimed in an angry voice. I only wanted the confirmation of it that you have given me. Ivan, that one who makes friendly proffers to one's face and strikes in treachery when the back is turned. He strode up and down the room for a moment, and then turned to the captive again. His tone was as calm as it had been in the beginning. Proceed, he ordered. In this he has partially succeeded, but his ambitions run higher, and he dreams of establishing his power over the people outside the borders, the Ruthenians and Lithuanians. Knowing them to be willingly under Polish domain, however, even the city of Kiev, which fell beneath Tartar rule, he wishes instead to strike a blow at the Poles in the Ukraine. Someone advised that he loose the Tartars against the Poles, and an ambassador was even sent to find out what would induce the Khan to send his warriors to fight the Poles. The answer that he made was a curious one, and that was, asked the king. This was his answer. He would lead his Tartars against the Poles in the Ukraine on one condition, and that was that Ivan should deliver into his hands the great Tarnov Crystal. At this the whole company started, chief among them Pan Andrew, for none of them had suspected that such great importance was even now attached to the stone. How did he know of the crystal? Asked the king. Everyone in the East knows of the great Tarnov Crystal, answered Bogdan. Every worker of magic, every astrologer, every chief, every prince is desirous of possessing this treasure. For it is said that in addition to being a jewel of great value, it has this quality also, that one may look into it and there read of the future. One may also find there secrets of great worth. One may see the faces of men long since in their graves. There are many legends and stories of it too, and since the days when it disappeared from Tarnov, when the Tartars conquered western lands, there has been search after search to find it. The king thought for a few seconds. Then the Khan of the Tartars knew that he was asking Ivan for an impossibility when he demanded the crystal. Does that mean that he meant to refuse to go against the Poles? Please, your majesty, it was no such thing, Bogdan stated emphatically. A short time ago, a servant who had left the services of this man here, he pointed to Pan Andrew, went to the land of the Tartars and there spread the report about that the crystal was to be had for the taking, that it was hidden in a country house in the Ukraine. You may be sure that this reached the ears of the Khan, whose passion for curious jewels is almost a madness, and when I, going from Ivan to Tartary, learned this, then Ivan promised the Khan that he would get him the crystal if it could be gotten. You were the go-between, Bogdan bowed, and Ivan sent you to get it from Pan Andrew. Bogdan bowed, though not quite so low. Fire leaped into the king's eyes. Daub that you are, he said, less than beast in all things that Christians believe. For this you must destroy a man's house and ruin his fields, yes, and threaten his life too, if it would serve your purpose. God knows my kingly duties lie heavily upon me. The CA, all that I seek in this my commonwealth is peace, peace with my neighbors and happiness for my people. And yet Poland is ever insulted to the point where nothing but war is possible. It is not enough that enemies on the north and west threaten. There must be plots against our happiness on the south and east. Oh, Poland, Poland, when will the day come that thy sons and daughters may enjoy the tranquility that God has designed for all people? As to you, he turned again to Bogdan, what further have you to say? Only that I have failed, answered Bogdan miserably, and only that I know that I shall go free, for there was never yet Jagiello who did not keep his word. Though had it not been for this creature here, he pointed to the alchemist, who from the rear of the room had been watching the scene through half-shut eyes, I should have had the crystal long ago. The king did not reply. Take him away, he said to a guard. A captain in armor came forward. Deliver this Bogdan at sunrise to the guards of the Florian Gate. Tell them to see that he has safe conduct through to the border, but that his chains are not to be struck off until he reaches the frontier. After that, let happen what will, but if he so much as sets foot again upon Polish soil, he shall be hanged to the nearest tree. When they had departed, he said to Pan Andrew, In this my right and duty of kingship in the Commonwealth of Poland, I commend you most heartily as a man who has been of great service to his country. It is a most extraordinary and gracious thing that a family such as yours should be so faithful to its word through so many years, and be willing to suffer so much for an oath once given. Therefore to you go my whole thanks. He took the gold chain from his throat. It was a thing of wondrous beauty, of heavy, solid links cut out of the purest metal. Wear this, he said, placing it with his own hands over Pan Andrew's shoulders. This chain shall ever be to you the token of your faithfulness. I shall see to it that the state makes return to you for the property which you have lost, for in so losing it you have conferred a favor upon us all. Had the crystal been taken by these thieves and delivered to the Khan of the Tartars, it is probably true that by now the Ukraine had begun to be overrun by Tartars and the armies of Ivan. In due time I shall see to it that a more formal and proper reward is given you. Here Giancanti made a sign that the interview was finished, and the whole company fell upon their knees before the king. He too stooped, but only to pick up the crystal which had lain upon the floor before him during the entire interview. It seemed to Joseph, glancing up at that moment, that the instant the king's eyes were fixed upon the stone, he became suddenly oblivious to everything else that was before him, and stood as one in a dream or trance, gazing into the depths of the fearsomely beautiful thing. Chapter 16. The last of the great Tarnov Crystal. Joseph and his father were still kneeling when there came unexpectedly a certain happening that changed the whole complexion of the day. It came from the alchemist. He had been listening attentively through all the talk. He had followed back and forth the give and take of conversation, the balancing of argument, the gestures, the decisions, even though his eyes had seemed but half open. Just at this final moment he sprang up from his place behind the others like a dog leaping for a bone, and snatched the Tarnov Crystal out of the hands of the king. Gripping it, he rushed like one gone wholly mad straight for the door, brushing aside a guard who fell back in astonishment. "Stop him!" cried Giancanti. "He will do something desperate." They might better have tried to stop the wind. He was through the door and out on the balcony and down the steps to the court below, where the guards, though astonished, had yet no pretext for seizing him, since he was an honored guest, one of the party of Giancanti. Through the little entrance to the court he went at top speed, just as the king, the scepter-bearers, and the guards, followed by Pan Andrew and Joseph with Giancanti behind, raced along the balcony and shouted to the guards below. These at once set out in pursuit, shouting in turn to guards at the farther gates. But the alchemist was traveling like a hurricane, and passing the men-at-arms at the very entrance to the castle, he was off down the slope to the meadows below, where he swung to the left and bore toward the spot where the Vistula curves about the base of the Wawel. Pan Andrew and Joseph continued in pursuit with the guards, but the king with Jan Canty, seeing the alchemist's direction, hurried to the extreme end of the fortifications where one looks down directly to the river. At the very water's edge, the alchemist turned and beckoned to his pursuers to stop, threatening by his motions to throw himself into the current, which at that time of the year was swollen and swift. They paused, helpless, waiting until he chose to speak. "Listen," he cried, gazing first at the pursuing party that stood not far distant from him on the shore, and then directly upward where Jan Canty and the king were leaning over the wall. A curious figure he presented as he stood there for a moment in silence, his garments sadly disordered, his hair twitched hither and thither by the wind, his features working from emotion, the globe of amazing beauty in his hands. "Listen!" His voice now rose shrill and screaming. "It was I that stole the crystal from Pan Andrew. The first sight of it drove honesty from my head, as it has driven honesty from the heads of many who have seen it. I saw there all that magicians and astrologers of all ages have devoutly wished for. I saw there the means of working out a great name for myself, of becoming famous, of becoming envied over all the world. I was tempted and I fell, but I shall see to it that no more trouble comes from this accursed stone." He paused, overcome by the effort of so much speaking, but in a second a flood of wild laughter burst from him. "There was the student Tring," he shouted. "Yes, Tring, who used to be my student. Because I looked so much into the crystal, my mind grew weak, and he knew, and I knew. It was he who said that if we but possessed the secret of turning brass into gold, then we should have power without stint. And it was he who first directed me to read in the glass what formula I might find therein for such magic. What did I find there? Tea. Only the reflections of my own crazed brain. And at last between us we have done nothing but cause want and misery and suffering all over Krakow. It is because of our madness that half the city is now but a heap of ashes, that men and women and children are homeless and in poverty." With these words his voice shrank to a wail, and he stood, a pitiful figure, his shoulders drooping and his face turned toward the ground. "Cease, man, we are thy friends," shouted the scholar. "Nay, such as I have no friends, but—" his shoulders suddenly straightened, "with such jewels as this that cause strife between man and man, and war between nation and nation, here, now, I make an end." Then raising himself to such a height that for a moment he appeared to be a giant, he swung about and hurled the crystal into the air with all his force. The sun struck it there, as it seemed for a moment to hang between earth and sky like a glittering bubble or a shining planet. Then it fell, until it dropped with a splash into the black, hurried waters of the Vistula River, so that the circles for a moment beat back the waves of the rushing torrent. Then all was as before. Deep silence fell upon the onlookers. There was in the man's act something solemn, something unearthly, something supernatural. His emotion was so great, and the crystal had been such a beauteous thing, and when Jan Canty said, "Let us pray," the whole company fell upon their knees. When he had finished a simple prayer, they went forward and took up the alchemist where he had fallen, for he had dropped down as if he had been suddenly overcome by a sickness. They carried him back to the tower of the Church of Our Lady Mary, where his niece and Pan Andrew's wife watched over him. Meanwhile, the king called the scholar into conference, and after much parley and much weighing of pros and cons, it was decided that no attempt should be made to rescue the crystal from the bed of the river. There had been in its history too much of suffering and misfortune to make it a thing at all desirable to possess, in spite of the purity of its beauty. And should its hiding place become known, Should a foreign power again seek to obtain it, what chance had such a power with the king's army and the fortified city of the Wawel forever ready in its defense? Surely never had treasure a safer resting place. And so to this day it has never been disturbed, though in later centuries many men have sought for it, and it rests somewhere in the Vistula River near the Wawel, where the alchemist Kreutz threw it in the year 1462. Pan Andrew received from the state enough recompense to rebuild his house in the Ukraine, and he repaired there that same year, taking with him Elzbietka and the alchemist who was broken in health for a long time as the result of his experiences. When he came to his senses a few days after he had thrown the crystal into the river, he had returned to his right mind fully, though he had no remembrance of the dark scenes in which he had played a part. The student Tring must have left for his home in Germany directly after the fire, for he was never seen again in Krakow. In later years he gained some fame in his own native village by the practice of magic, in which it was said that he often called upon the devil himself for assistance. Joseph continued his studies in the university until he reached his 22nd year, and then he returned to the Ukraine to manage his father's estates. He was shortly afterward married to Elzbietka, the friend of his boyhood days. And now, since we have come to the happy end of all things in this tale, may we close with the thought that every Pole carries in his mind, with the words that are foremost in the Polish national hymn, "May God save Poland." It is the year 1926. The Vistula River now no longer turns at the Wawel Hill and plunges straight through the Krakow plain, dividing the city of Kazimierz from the city of Krakow, but instead swings far to the left and surrounds the whole plain, now the new city. The castles and towers and cathedral of the Wawel still rise proudly on the hill, as in former days. St. Andrew's, which has defied fire, siege, and war for 8 centuries, raises its head, 2 towers. Above Grodska Street, the old cloth hall, beautified during the Renaissance, still stands in the middle of the central Rheineck. And although the glory of former days is departed from the city and the kings no longer sit in the castle on the hill, there has come with the years the growth of a new glory, the glory of culture as seen in the university of 14th century origin, in the schools of fine arts and music and handicraft and trade. From all Poland come students to study and to live in this venerable city, which is Gothic in every corner and every gable, save where here and there a bit of Romanesque wall or arch has survived the Tartar, or the Cossack, or the Swede. But the chief glory of the city is the church of Our Lady Mary. It no longer stands apart, a monument visible from afar as of old. Other palaces and buildings have shut it in, and one sees its towers only until one is close upon it. Then the sudden magnificence leaps upon the visitor. A splendid silence lurking in its high roof descends suddenly like the thousands of pigeons that thunder down for particles of bread. Beneath one's feet is the old city cemetery. There on the walls are the tablets and shrines. There at the south doorway are the iron collars that once clasped the throats of petty criminals as they stood supplicating the prayers and pennies of the faithful. Inside, the church is a veritable miracle of beauty. Above its exquisite wood carvings and choir rises a vaulted roof of sky blue studded with stars. Images of stone look down from breaks in the Gothic fluting. Tablets, banners, altars, shrines all strike alike upon the sight in amazing beauty. But listen, is the organ playing? Whence come those notes that float down from above like God's own music from heaven?
They come from the towers, for the hour is striking on the bell, and a trumpeter is playing at one of the open tower windows. And that tune? It is the Haina, the same tune played by a young man so many centuries ago when the Tartars burned the city. And listen, the trumpeter breaks off his song in the middle of a note. 4 times he sounds the Haina, once at each of the 4 windows, west, south, east, north. And many a man or woman or child on hearing that song thinks of the days when the young life was given to country and God and duty. Poland has been through many fires since that time. She has had centuries of war, a century of extinction. But in all that time the Hynal has sounded with each passing hour, and men have sworn each year to keep the custom unto the very end of time. Hark, it is sounding now. May it bring in an epoch of peace to all men.